There are names in history that exist almost entirely as questions. They are not the names of great battles or of triumphant rulers, but of places that hold a particular, quiet resonance. One such name is Roanoke. It arrives in the mind as a whisper, a concept of vanishing, of something incomplete. For nearly 450 years, it has been the foundational mystery of a new world. A story of 117 English souls who stepped onto a remote shore and, in the space of 3 short years, were absorbed by the landscape, leaving behind only silence and a single cryptic word. This is not a story of ghosts, but of people, of families, of political ambition, and of a profound, isolating human reality. We are not here to solve the mystery, so much as to understand its components, to trace the edges of the void they left behind. Join us as we respectfully uncover these hidden histories and soothe the curious mind. Our story does not begin with a disappearance. It begins, as so many of these ventures do, with ambition. It begins in the court of Elizabeth I, a Protestant queen ruling an ascendant, ambitious, and financially strained England. The world, in the late 16th century, was a chessboard dominated by the vast Catholic empire of Habsburg Spain. Spain's galleons, heavy with silver from the mines of the New World, were the engine of its global power. For England, and for Elizabeth's favoured courtiers, the path to national greatness and personal wealth lay not in Europe, but across the daunting, uncharted expanse of the Atlantic. The most prominent of these courtiers was Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was the archetype of the Elizabethan Renaissance man. A poet, a soldier, a spy, and a relentless self-promoter. He was also a man of profound vision. In 1584, he secured a royal charter from Elizabeth, granting him the right to discover, search, find out, and view such remote, heathen, and barbarous lands, not actually possessed of any Christian prince. This was, in essence, a license to challenge Spain. The territory he claimed, a vast and vaguely defined stretch of the North American coastline, he named Virginia, in honour of his patron, the Virgin Queen. Raleigh's first attempt, in 1585, was not a colony in the way we understand it. It was a military garrison, a privateering base, established on that same sandy, isolated strip of land, Roanoke Island. Led by the soldier Ralph Lane, its purpose was twofold: to search for gold and a passage to the Pacific, and, perhaps more critically, to harass Spanish shipping. With this military venture travelled 2 men whose work provides the very foundation of our knowledge. One was Thomas Harriot, a brilliant scientist and ethnographer. The other was the man at the heart of our story, John White, a gentleman artist and cartographer. For the year they were there, White and Harriot did not just build a fort, they observed. White's watercolours of the local Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Socotan, the Croatoan, and the surrounding flora and fauna are not just art. They are primary source documents of immense anthropological value. They depict a complex, settled society with established towns, sophisticated agriculture, and deep spiritual beliefs. But the 1585 venture was a failure. Ralph Lane, a man of military, not diplomatic instincts, quickly soured relations with the local tribes. His men, dependent on the indigenous population for food they could not grow themselves, resorted to threats and, eventually, violence. In a preemptive and brutal attack, Lane's men murdered the local Sokotan chief, Wingina. The relationship was irrevocably broken. When Sir Francis Drake, fresh from raiding Spanish ports, sailed by in 1586, the starving and beleaguered garrison eagerly accepted a ride home. Raleigh, however, was undeterred. His charter was finite. If he failed to establish a permanent English presence, his claim on Virginia would expire. The 1585 venture had failed, he reasoned, because it was comprised of soldiers. They were men looking for a quick profit, unsuited for the patient work of building a new society. His 1587 attempt would be entirely different. It would be a true plantation, a self-sustaining civilian settlement. He funded it through a joint stock company, recruiting not soldiers, but families. These were artisans, farmers, and labourers, men who brought their wives and their children. This was an investment in permanence. He designated it the City of Raleigh and appointed as its governor his trusted artist from the first voyage, John White. The list of the 117 colonists who boarded the ships in the spring of 1587 is a deeply human document. We see the names of blacksmiths, of masons, of coopers. We see 19 single women and 9 young boys. We see Ananias Dare, a tiler and bricklayer, and his pregnant wife, Eleanor. Eleanor was Governor John White's own daughter. This was not just a political venture for White. It was a profound personal and familial one. The plan, agreed upon with Raleigh, was not to return to the hostile environment of Roanoke. The 1585 failure had proven the island's poor soil and its compromised political landscape. The new City of Raleigh was to be established some 100 miles north on the deep, promising waters of the Chesapeake Bay. From the start, the voyage was fraught. The expedition's pilot, a Portuguese navigator named Simon Fernandez, was a man of considerable skill but questionable loyalty. He was a privateer, arguably more interested in chasing Spanish prize ships than in shuttling colonists. Tensions between White and Fernandez fill the pages of White's log. Upon reaching the Outer Banks of North Carolina in the heat of July 1587, Fernandez refused to sail farther. He claimed the summer was too advanced, the season for storms approaching. He insisted the colonists disembark at Roanoke, the place they had explicitly intended to avoid. Whether this was pragmatic seamanship or a deliberate act of sabotage, an effort to abandon the colonists and return to privateering, is a debate that continues. What we know from the primary sources is that John White and the 117 colonists were, in effect, marooned. They had no choice. On July 22, 1587, they were put ashore on Roanoke Island, a place now stained by the memory of Ralph Lane's violence. They found the 1585 settlement in ruins. The fort was razed, the houses dismantled. The environment was immediately precarious. They set about rebuilding, repairing the structures, but their diplomatic situation was desperate. They needed allies, and they needed food. White's first act was to re-establish contact with the indigenous population. He turned to Manteo, a Croatoan man who had travelled with the 1585 venture back to England, learned English, and now returned with White as a crucial liaison. Manteo and his people, based on the nearby Barrier Island, modern-day Hatteras, remained friendly. They were, it seemed, a separate political entity from the Croatoan on the mainland, the tribe that Lane had attacked. But the mainland tribes remained hostile. Within days of their arrival, a colonist named George Howe was ambushed and killed while crabbing alone. The attack, as described, was brutal, his body pierced by 16 arrows. It was a clear act of retribution for the murder of Wingina the previous year. The colony was, in effect, under siege, cut off from the agricultural bounty of the mainland. Amidst this tension and dread, a profound symbol of the colony's purpose arrived. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. She was the first English child born in the New World. Governor White, her grandfather, recorded the event. They named her Virginia. It was a single point of light in an encroaching darkness. The colonists quickly realized their situation was untenable. They had arrived too late to plant their own crops. Their provisions were meagre, and the local Croatoan were now their sworn enemies. They were entirely dependent on the limited goodwill of Manteo's Croatoan tribe, and on the hope of resupply from England. The settlers convened and made a desperate decision. Someone had to return to England to plead their case to Raleigh, to gather a relief fleet before winter set in. Their choice for this envoy was obvious: Governor John White. White's journal from this period is heavy with conflict. He refused outright to leave his family, his daughter and his newborn granddaughter. He wrote that the colonists, with one voice, threatened that if he did not go, they would consider him the author of their destruction. They were, in effect, constraining him to go. Finally, he relented. But before he left, a protocol was established. If the colonists had to leave Roanoke Island, they were to carve their destination into a prominent tree. If they left in distress or under duress, they were to add a symbol above the carving, a Maltese cross. In late August 1587, scant weeks after the birth of Virginia Dare, John White boarded Simon Fernandez's ship for the return voyage. He cast a final look back at the small, fragile settlement, at the 116 men, women, and children he was leaving behind on that remote, fabled shore. He promised vehemently that he would return by the following spring. He could not have known, as he sailed away, that he would never see any of them again. He could not have known that England was on the brink of a total war that would make his return impossible. And he could not have known that he was setting the stage for a mystery that would endure for centuries, defined not by what he found, but by the utter, profound silence that awaited his return. John White arrived back in England in November of 1587, a desperate man on a critical mission. He carried with him the hopes of the 116 people he had left behind, a group that included his own daughter and granddaughter. His one and only goal was to convince Sir Walter Raleigh and the English crown to immediately finance and dispatch a relief fleet. He found an England in the grip of a national existential crisis. All of Europe was bracing for war. Philip II of Spain, infuriated by English privateering and the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was assembling the largest naval fleet in history, the Grande y Felicissima Armada. Its sole purpose was to invade and conquer Protestant England. In the face of this imminent threat, Queen Elizabeth I issued a general order. All seaworthy vessels were to be stayed, commandeered for the defence of the realm. No ship, no matter how small, could be spared for a colonial relief effort. Raleigh, his patron, was now consumed by war preparations. The city of Raleigh in the New World was, for the moment, a distant secondary concern. When we read White's letters and petitions from this time, the sense of his powerlessness is profound. He was a man of art and cartography, not a man of high influence. He was forced to wait. The entire year of 1588, the year he had promised to return, slipped by in a fog of war. The Armada sailed in July, and while it was ultimately defeated by a combination of English tactics and catastrophic weather, the Protestant wind, the war with Spain was not over. It had just begun. White, in his desperation, did manage to secure two small pinnaces, the Brave and the Roe, in the spring of 1588, arguing they were too small to be of use in the war effort. But this was a commercial venture, not a royal one. To fund the trip, the captains were given license to engage in privateering en route to Virginia. This proved to be a disastrous decision. Before they had even cleared the coast of France, they spotted a Spanish prize ship. In their greed, they engaged, but the battle went against them. The Brave was attacked and boarded. White himself was wounded, fighting on the deck. The ships were looted of their supplies, the very supplies intended for the colony. And the expedition was forced to limp, defeated, back to an English port. The failure was total. And it was final. For another 2 years, the war effort and financial ruin made any further attempt impossible. 1588 became 1589. 1589 became 1590. 3 full years had passed since he had seen his family. 3 winters without resupply. By 1590, Raleigh's interest had largely pivoted. He was now focused on his estates in Ireland. The Roanoke venture was a financial black hole. John White, however, was relentless. He finally managed to secure passage, but it was a bitter compromise. He would not be given his own relief mission. Instead, he was permitted to hitch a ride with a privateering expedition financed by a merchant named John Watts. This voyage, which set sail in March of 1590, was not a rescue mission. It was a plundering expedition to the West Indies, and White was, essentially, just a passenger. The captains had agreed reluctantly to drop him at Roanoke on their way home, after they had filled their holds with Spanish treasure. What this meant for White was an agonizing delay. For months, from spring into the deep summer of 1590, he was forced to sail through the Caribbean, a passive observer to the brutal commerce of privateering. His journal from this period meticulously records the chasing of frigates, the sacking of coastal towns, the skirmishes, and the division of spoils. And through this clinical recitation of events, we can feel the mounting tension of a man watching the precious summer sailing season waste away. Every day spent chasing a Spanish ship was a day not spent searching for his daughter. Finally, in mid-August, the fleet turned north. They had taken their prizes, and the time had come to honour the bargain. As they approached the treacherous coastline of the Outer Banks, the weather, as it so often does in that region in late summer, began to turn. The seas grew heavy. On the evening of August 15th, 1590, 3 years almost to the day since he had left, White's ship dropped anchor off the coast, near the place he remembered as Roanoke. The air was thick and humid. From the deck, through the twilight, the search party saw it. A plume of smoke rising from the woods on the island. It was a sign of life, a signal, perhaps. Hope, which must have been worn thin after 3 years, surged. The privateer captains, however, were wary. This was a notoriously dangerous coastline, a graveyard of ships, and a storm was clearly brewing. They agreed to send a party ashore in 2 of the ship's smaller boats, but they would not risk the main vessels any closer. What followed, as recorded in White's own journal, was a sequence of harrowing and ultimately tragic events. The sea was very rough, the waves breaking with tremendous force on the sandbars. As one of the boats, a small skiff, attempted to make the landing, it was struck by a swell and capsized. The boat was lost, and of the men aboard, 7 drowned in the violent surf. This incident was a catastrophe. The privateer crew, who had only ever been reluctant participants in this rescue, now turned mutinous. They had lost 7 of their own, and their captain had lost a valuable boat, all for a colony they had no stake in. They refused to go further. John White, his heart hardening against the loss and the fear, prevailed upon the captain of the second boat. He had to know what that smoke was. He had to reach the settlement. That evening, with the skeleton crew, he finally pushed through the surf and landed on the beach. It was dark. They had brought trumpets and intended to play English songs, hoping for a familiar melody in response. They made their way from the beach inland toward the smoke they had seen. But as they approached, they found only a great fire made of grass and rotten trees. It was not a signal fire. It was a wildfire, or perhaps, as some have speculated, a decoy set by the local tribes. There was no sign of human habitation. Defeated for the night, they returned to their boat and waited for dawn. On the morning of August 18th, what would have been his granddaughter Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday, John White and his small party walked to the site of the 1587 settlement. The air was silent. They called out, but only the sounds of the island returned to them. When they reached the clearing, they did not find a scene of destruction. They did not find bodies or the burned ruins of a massacre. What they found was, in many ways, more perplexing. The settlement was gone, but it had not been destroyed. It had been dismantled. The houses, the cottages, the small workshops, all had been taken down. The lumber, it seemed, had been salvaged and removed. This was not the work of a raiding party, which would have burned the settlement to the ground. This was the sign of an orderly, planned, and unhurried departure. What they did find was a new structure. Surrounding the perimeter of the old settlement, the colonists had constructed a high palisado made of great trees, with cortinas and flankers very fort-like. This was a significant defensive fortification. It told White that, in the 3 years he was gone, the colonists had come to feel deeply threatened. But it also told him they had the time, the resources and the organization to build this formidable defense. And then he saw the carvings. The protocol he had established in 1587 was clear. If they had to move, they were to carve their destination into a tree. If they left in any kind of distress, they were to add a Maltese cross. On one of the great posts of the palisade, at the entrance, he saw carved in fair Romaine letters the word Croatoan. He searched the area meticulously. He looked on every post, on every tree. He found no cross or sign of distress anywhere. To John White, the carving was not, in fact, a mystery at all. It was an answer. Croatoan was the island just to the south, the modern-day Hatteras Island. It was the home of Manteo, his friend, his liaison. It was the home of the only indigenous allies the English had. The carving, combined with the absence of the Maltese cross, provided a clear, logical, and, for White, deeply reassuring message. His people had not been slaughtered. They had, facing a threat he could only guess at, and with their supplies dwindling, chosen to leave Roanoke and join Manteo's people. They had dismantled their homes and carefully carried the materials with them. He also made a more perplexing discovery. He had, upon his departure in 1587, buried several chests containing his personal effects, his maps, his precious watercolours, his armour. He had hidden them to protect them. He now found them dug up, the lids broken, his maps and drawings torn from their covers, and spoiled by the rain. His armour rusted through. This piece of evidence does not align as neatly with the narrative of an orderly departure. Had the colonists dug them up in a hurry, taking what they needed and leaving the rest? Or had this been the work of hostile natives, looting the site after the colonists had already gone? We cannot know. But for White, the primary objective was clear. His family was not here. They were at Croatoan. He returned to the ship, his heart for the first time filled not with dread, but with a new, great comfort. He informed the captains. The plan was simple. They would sail the 50 miles south to Croatoan Island. And then the weather, which had been threatening for days, finally broke. A foul and stormy night descended. The wind howled from the northeast. The ships, battered by the gale, began to drag their anchors. The captain of White's own ship, in a panic, lost his primary anchor cable. They were now in mortal danger, at risk of being driven onto the shoals and destroyed. The captain made his decision. It was absolute. The season was over. He had lost 7 men, a boat, and his best anchor. He would not risk his ship and the lives of his remaining crew for a lost cause. He overruled Governor White. White, we must imagine, was frantic. He was, by his own calculation, mere hours, mere miles from his destination. He could likely see the island in the distance. He pleaded. He argued. He offered a reward. The captain proposed a compromise. They could not stay here. They would sail south to the West Indies to winter in a safe harbour and return in the spring of 1591. John White, defeated by the sea, had no choice but to agree. They sailed south, but as they did, the winds shifted again. They were blown eastward, out into the open Atlantic. The compromise was abandoned. The privateer, his holds full of treasure, set a course for England. John White was forcibly carried back across the ocean, gazing backward at a shoreline that held his family. He never set foot in the New World again. He had come so close, only to have his answer snatched away by a storm. He died a few years later, in 1593, at one of Raleigh's estates in Ireland, his life defined by the fundamental, agonizing incompleteness of his search. He left behind only his journal, a primary source document that gives us not a solution, but only the precise, heart-breaking parameters of the mystery. For John White, the carving Croatoan was not a riddle. It was an itinerary. It was a clear, unambiguous statement of intent, left by a community that had made a rational and likely prearranged choice. Yet, for nearly 400 years that followed, the search for the lost colony remained stubbornly, almost willfully, fixated on Roanoke Island itself. Explorers, historians, and tourists returned again and again to that small patch of land, sifting the same silent soil, as if the answer to the colonists' departure must, paradoxically, be found at their origin. This is a profound flaw in historical inquiry. As researchers, we must follow the evidence, not the myth. And the primary source evidence, left in plain sight by the colonists themselves, points south. What if we take John White at his word? What if we accept the carving not as a cryptic clue, but as a simple, factual statement? The Croatoan solution is, at its core, a theory of assimilation. It posits that the colonists were not lost, not massacred, and not vanished. They simply moved. They chose to amalgamate with the one local tribe that had shown them consistent friendship, the Croatoan people of Manteo. To truly analyze this, we must move beyond the confines of Roanoke Island and examine the anthropological context of their would-be hosts and the hard, archaeological evidence that has, after centuries, begun to emerge from the sand. First, we must understand who the Croatoan were. They were an Algonquian-speaking people, part of the larger cultural group that inhabited the coastal plain of North Carolina. But they were distinct from their mainland neighbors, the Socotan, who had become so hostile. The Croatoan inhabited the long, sandy barrier islands that form the Outer Banks, specifically the island we now call Hatteras, which was then known simply as Croatoan. This was not a backwater. This was a strategic location. The Croatoan were, by necessity, master navigators, fishermen, and salvagers. They controlled the inlets and the sound, a vital artery of coastal trade and communication. John White's own watercolours, those precious primary source documents from 1585, depict Croatoan and its main village, also called Croatoan, as a stable, established community. We see longhouses, ceremonial structures, and fields of maize. This was a sophisticated, self-sufficient society, deeply adapted to its environment. And, crucially, the English had a unique, formal bond with them. This bond was personified in Manteo. Manteo was not just a guide. He was a political figure of considerable standing within his tribe. He had now made 2 transatlantic voyages. He had lived in London. He had learned the English language. And he had met Sir Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth. Shortly before White's departure in 1587, in a highly symbolic act, Manteo was baptized into the Church of England and given the title Lord of Roanoke by the English. This was far more than ceremony. From the English perspective, it was the creation of a feudal-style alliance, establishing Manteo as their official, titled vassal and ally in the New World. From the Croatoan perspective, it was likely seen as a powerful political and military compact. They were aligning themselves with this new, technologically potent group. Now, let us place ourselves in the minds of the 117 colonists in the winter of 1587, after John White has failed to return. They are isolated. Their provisions are gone. The mainland Socotan, still seeking revenge for Ralph Lane's actions, are a constant threat. They are facing starvation on an island with poor soil. Just 50 miles to the south is their only ally. An ally formally bound to them by the title given to Manteo. And that ally lives on a more defensible island, at the center of a rich coastal estuary with a stable food supply. The decision to move seems not just logical, but inevitable. It was the only rational choice for survival. The construction of the palisade at Roanoke, which White found in 1590, was likely a defensive measure against the Socotan while they waited for White. When he did not come in 1588, and then not again in 1589, the time for waiting was over. They would have executed their contingency plan. They would have systematically dismantled their homes, salvaging the precious nails, timbers, and tools, loaded them into the pinnace and boats left with them, and made the careful 50-mile journey south to join Manteo. If this is true, why did no one simply go and find them? John White, of course, was thwarted by a storm. But what of Raleigh? Raleigh did, in fact, claim to have sent subsequent search expeditions. In 1602, he financed a voyage under Samuel Mace, but, like all ventures of the time, it was a hybrid. It was part search and rescue, part commercial speculation. Mace's primary objective was to gather valuable sassafras wood. They spent weeks harvesting on the coast. But when it came time to sail to Croatoan, a storm conveniently, or perhaps deliberately, damaged the ship, and they returned to England. The most significant search effort came from the next, and only, successful English venture. Jamestown. Established in 1607. The Jamestown colonists were acutely aware of their predecessors. Finding the Roanoke survivors was part of their royal charter. John Smith, the colony's famous leader, produced a map in 1608 based on indigenous intelligence. On it, he marked the locations of surviving English colonists. He too attempted to search, sending parties to the south. But Smith was given a dark and very different story. He was told by Wahun Senancour, the paramount chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, that the English settlers had indeed moved. They had left Roanoke and gone to live with another tribe, the Chesapeake, who resided near the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. But Wahun Senancour, in a brutal consolidation of his own power, had, by his own admission, attacked that tribe and slain the English survivors just before Jamestown's arrival. He even presented John Smith with certain pieces of copper as proof. This Powhatan massacre theory has long been a primary competitor to the Croatoan solution. But we must analyse it with academic skepticism. Was Wahun Senancour telling the truth? Or was he delivering a calculated political threat to the new English arrivals, essentially saying, "Do not defy me, as the others did, for I have the power to destroy you"? It is also possible that both theories are true. The 117 colonists, a large group, may have fragmented. A small, exploratory party may have gone north to the Chesapeake, as was their original intention, and been killed, while the bulk of the population, the women, the children, the families, went south to the safety of Croatoan. For centuries, this is where the trail went cold. The Croatoan theory remained just that, a theory, supported by a single carved word. But in the 1990s, the inquiry shifted. If the colonists did go to Hatteras Island, if they did live with the Croatoan, they would have left a footprint. They would have left behind the durable, non-biodegradable artifacts of their 16th century English lives. This is the work of the Croatoan Archaeological Society, now known as the Lost Colony Research Group, and archaeologists like Dr. Mark Horton from the University of Bristol. For decades, they have been conducting meticulous, systematic excavations at a site known as Cape Creek, on modern-day Hatteras Island. This site is the known historical location of the main Croatoan village, and it is here that the silent earth has begun to speak. When we, as researchers, analyse the finds from Cape Creek, we are not looking for a treasure chest. We are looking for the mundane, domestic refuse of everyday life. And that is precisely what has been found. But mixed in at the same archaeological stratum as the indigenous pottery and shell tools is a small but electrifying assemblage of late 16th century European objects. These are not, we must stress, the kinds of items that would typically be traded. They are not cannonballs or chests of beads. They are small, personal, domestic items. Let us examine this evidence. The finds include fragments of German stoneware, specifically Weserware, a distinctive type of pottery. Through analysis of shipping manifests from the period, we know that this exact type of stoneware was a common supply item for English ventures of the 1580s. They have found pieces of Surrey, Hampshire border ware, a common English pottery of the era. They have found copper aglets, the small metal tips from shoelaces. They have found a snap-hands, a component from an early flintlock musket of a type used by the English in the 1580s. They have found a lead pencil and a small piece of a writing slate, suggesting literacy. They have found fragments of crucibles used for assaying or melting metals. Any one of these items found in isolation could be explained away. It could be wreckage from a ship or a trade item that passed through many hands, but the assemblage, the sheer variety of domestic, personal and professional items, all dated to the correct period, all found inside the palisade of the main Croatoan village, presents a case of immense power. It is the footprint of a small English community, living with the Croatoan, using their own tools and pottery alongside indigenous ones. Perhaps the most evocative and academically compelling of these finds is a small 16th century gold signet ring. It is a gentleman's ring, and it bears a specific engraved crest, a prancing horse. Through meticulous genealogical and heraldic research, this crest has been traced. It belonged to the Kendall family. When we review the primary source documents, the colonist lists, we find a Master Kendall listed as a member of the 1585 military garrison, the one that preceded White's lost colony. This ring is a powerful piece of evidence. It suggests two possibilities. Either a member of the 1587 colony had acquired the ring from the 1585 venture and brought it to Croatoan, or, perhaps more intriguingly, it suggests that English contact and integration with the Croatoan began even earlier than 1587. It is possible that some men from the 1585 venture, when Lane returned to England, chose to stay behind and live with Manteo's people. This would mean that when the 1587 colonists arrived, they were not just moving to join allies, they were moving to join fellow Englishmen who had already assimilated. This archaeological data, the pottery, the tools, the ring, is the hard science. It provides a material anchor for the theory. But there is another, softer and more complex line of inquiry. The evidence of linguistics and genetics. This thread leads us inland, away from the coast, to Robeson County, North Carolina. This area is the modern home of the Lumbee people, one of the largest indigenous tribes in the United States. The Lumbee are a people whose origins have long been a subject of intense academic and political debate. They are an amalgamation of several eastern tribes, displaced and fragmented by colonial expansion. But their own persistent oral tradition, recorded by the very first Europeans to encounter them in the 18th century, holds a remarkable claim. Their oral history states that their ancestors came from Roanoke in Virginia. It states that they are the descendants of a blending of the Croatoan people and the English settlers. For a long time, this was dismissed as folklore, a romantic origin myth. But when we examine the circumstantial evidence, it becomes harder to dismiss. When Scots and English settlers first pushed into this inland area in the 1730s, they did not find a people speaking an Algonquian language. They found a large, settled, agricultural community that was already, inexplicably, speaking English. Their physical appearance was noted as a mix of indigenous and European features. And then there are the surnames. When the first census and tax lists were compiled, over 40 of the surnames common among the Lumbee people matched exactly the surnames on the 10 colonist list from 1587. Names like Cooper, Harvey, Dare, Stevens, and White. We must tread with extreme caution here. This is not empirical proof. Surnames can be adopted. An oral history can be influenced by a famous local legend. However, the persistence of this tradition, combined with the linguistic evidence and the genetic markers, is, at the very least, a powerful corroboration of the Croatoan assimilation theory. The Lumbee claim is that their ancestors, the Croatoan, slowly migrated inland from Hatteras after 1650 to escape pressure from other tribes and the expanding English colony, bringing the admixed English families with them. Modern genetic studies, like the Lost Colony DNA project, have attempted to find a definitive link. They have tested the mtDNA, matrilineal, and Y chromosome, patrilineal lines of known Lumbee families with Roanoke surnames against those of known descendants of the families of the 1S87 colonists back in England. The results, thus far, have been inconclusive. 400 years of intermarriage, migration, and genetic drift have made a clean match almost impossible. But what this body of evidence, the carving, the anthropological logic, the archaeological artifacts, and the Lumbee oral history suggests is a narrative far more logical and far less sensational than the myth. It is a narrative of survival. The 117 colonists were not lost. They were, perhaps, simply the first to be found. Faced with the choice of dying as Englishmen on a hostile shore or living as part of a new, blended, indigenous English community, they chose to live. They dismantled their settlement, carved their destination for John White to find, and began a new life with Manteo's people. The great mystery of Roanoke, then, may not be a mystery of disappearance at all. It may be a mystery of identity. The colonists and their children did not vanish. They simply, over the course of a generation, became Croatoan. They became, in effect, the first chapter of a new American people. The only reason we consider them lost is that 17th century England and later 19th century America preferred a tragic myth of English purity and disappearance over a more complex and far more probable human story of assimilation and cultural integration. The human mind, when faced with a void, has a tendency to fill it. We are, by nature, uncomfortable with silence, with ambiguity. We seek narrative. And when a story, like that of the 117 colonists, ends not with a final chapter, but with a single carved word, we are tempted to write the ending ourselves. The evidence we have examined, John White's own primary source journal and the archaeological footprint at Cape Creek, points overwhelmingly toward a rational, unhurried, and pre-planned assimilation with the Croatoan people. This is the most academically sound, evidence-based conclusion. It is, by all measures, the most probable. And yet, for 4 centuries, this has not been the most popular solution. It lacks a certain drama. It is a story of integration, not of tragedy. We must, therefore, as methodical researchers, turn our attention to the other theories that have echoed through history. We must respectfully investigate the darker possibilities, the narratives of massacre and misadventure, not to indulge in sensationalism, but to test their foundations against the same hard evidence. And, in doing so, we must also confront the strange modern spectres of forgery, where the desire for an answer became so great that it was, quite literally, manufactured. Let us first address the colonists' most immediate and palpable fear: the Spanish. The 1587 venture was, we must remember, an illegal settlement. It was an act of geopolitical defiance, an English flag planted firmly in territory claimed by the Habsburg Empire. Governor White's colonists were not just farmers, they were a strategic threat, a potential privateering base from which to attack Spain's silver fleets. When we read the colonists' letters, their greatest anxiety was not the indigenous population. It was the thought of a Spanish galleon appearing over the horizon. It is, therefore, a logical theory that a Spanish force, having learned of the colony's location, was dispatched to eradicate it. This would align with Spanish policy of the time. In 1565, they had ruthlessly destroyed the French Huguenot colony at Fort Caroline in Florida. But when we search for evidence, we find none. The Spanish Empire was a meticulous, almost pathologically thorough bureaucracy. Its archives in Seville are a vast, comprehensive record of its colonial activities. A military strike, a successful rooting out of their English rivals, would have been documented, celebrated, and reported in detail to King Philip II. The archives, however, are silent on this matter. Furthermore, we must consider the timeline. In 1588, Spain's entire naval and military focus was singular: the invasion of England. The resources of the Spanish Americas were redirected to support the Great Armada. The idea that in this moment of supreme national crisis, a specialized expedition would be diverted to hunt for a tiny, fledgling settlement on the Carolina coast is strategically improbable. By the time White returned in 1590, the Spanish certainly knew of the colony, but their reconnaissance missions located it far to the north on the Chesapeake Bay, where it was supposed to be. They searched for it, found nothing, and moved on. The evidence simply does not support a Spanish massacre. If not an external European power, then what of an internal, local one? This brings us to the second great massacre theory, the one provided by John Smith at Jamestown in 1607. This, we must recall, is the Powhatan Confession. Wahunsanako, the paramount chief of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, claimed to John Smith that he had been responsible for the colonists' demise. He stated that the colonists had left Roanoke and moved north, integrating with a tribe called the Chesapeake, who lived near the mouth of the bay that bears their name. This was, after all, their original intended destination. Wahunsanako, who was in the process of consolidating his own empire, viewed this Chesapeake English alliance as a threat, and so, by his own account, he attacked them and wiped them out. He even presented Smith with pieces of copper, suggesting they were spoils from the raid. When we analyze this primary source, we must apply academic skepticism. We must ask, was Wahun Senancour giving a factual report, or was he delivering a calculated political threat? Smith's Jamestown colony was the new English presence in his territory. By claiming to have destroyed the last English group, he was sending an unmistakable, chilling message. Do not defy me as the others did, for I have the power to destroy you. This was statecraft, a projection of power. It is, of course, entirely possible that he was telling the truth, but we must also consider the possibility of fragmentation. The 117 colonists were not a monolith. A small exploratory party, perhaps the single men, the more militaristic element, may have attempted to reach their original Chesapeake destination. This smaller group may well have been the one attacked by Powhatan. This would mean that both theories are, in a sense, true. A small fragment of the colony may have been lost in a massacre, while the main body, the families, the women, the children, including Eleanor and Virginia Dare, had traveled south to the prearranged safe harbor of Croatoan. This two-colony solution, a split, aligns with much of the disparate evidence. But what of the most obvious local threat? The Sokotan tribe on the mainland, whose chief, Wingina, had been murdered by Ralph Lane's 1585 expedition. This is a powerful motive for a revenge attack. And yet, this theory founders on the evidence John White himself recorded. First, there was the carving, Croatoan, and, critically, no cross or sign of distress. The colonists' own protocol, their prearranged signal, explicitly stated that they were not in distress. Second, there is the state of the settlement. A revenge-fueled massacre, a raid, would have been an act of chaotic, fiery violence. We would expect to find the settlement burned to the ground. We would expect to find the palisade toppled, the ground littered with the detritus of a desperate fight. Most grimly, we would expect to find human remains. The archaeological record of Roanoke shows none of this. Instead, White found a site that had been systematically dismantled. The houses were taken down, the heavy timbers salvaged. This was not the work of a war party. It was the work of a community moving. The evidence on the ground simply does not support a local massacre. This leads us to the quieter, sadder theories of misadventure. What if they simply perished? Perhaps in their desperation they took the pinnace, the small coastal vessel left with them, and attempted the impossible, a return voyage to England. This is a romantic but deeply implausible notion. The pinnace was not a transatlantic ship. To pack 117 people, including infants, onto such a boat for a 3,000-mile journey across the North Atlantic would be a suicidal act. And they were not suicidal. They were practical survivors. What if they simply starved? Or died of disease? This too is contradicted by the archaeological record. A community that perishes in place leaves a distinct footprint. It leaves middens, trash heaps, filled with its broken pottery, its worn-out tools. And it leaves graves. Despite centuries of excavation, no 1587-era cemetery has ever been found on Roanoke Island. No cluster of graves, no mass burial. The site is, in domestic terms, remarkably clean. This archaeological absence is, in itself, profound evidence. It tells us the people were not there. They did not die there. They left. All of these theories, the Spanish, the Powhatan, the Secatan, starvation, the sea, persist because they offer a definitive, tragic ending. The Croatoan theory offers something more complex, an ending that is also a beginning, a story of cultural transformation. But in the 1930s, a new narrative emerged, one that seemed to offer the perfect, tragic answer the public had always craved. It came in the form of stone. In 1937, a man named Louis E. Hammond, a tourist traveling in North Carolina, claimed to have found a 21-pound piece of chiseled quartzite near the Chowan River. The stone was covered in crude lettering. When transcribed, it purported to be a message from Eleanor White Dare herself. This first stone, the Chowan stone, was a sensation. It was a narrative in miniature, a voice from the grave. It told a story of misery and war. It claimed that 2 years after arriving, the colony was decimated by sickness and attack, and that only 7 remained. It reported the deaths of Ananias Dare and of Virginia. It was, in essence, a tombstone. And it ended with the haunting plea for her father, John White, to see it. It was signed E.W.D. The stone was brought to Emory University, where a committee of historians examined it. Their conclusion was tentative. They were skeptical, but they could not definitively disprove it. The temptation of a new primary source, the only one from the colonists themselves, was immense. Brunel College in Georgia, caught up in the fervour, purchased the stone and offered a reward for any others that might be found. This is where the story turns from history to farce. The reward offer predictably opened the floodgates. Over the next 3 years, a Georgia man named Bill Eberhardt, a stonecutter and artifact dealer, discovered over 40 more stones. These subsequent Dare stones were no longer just a plea. They were an epic. They chronicled, in almost novelistic detail, a long, tragic migration of the survivors. They supposedly walked from North Carolina deep into Georgia and then back toward the coast. The stones reported marriages to indigenous men, the birth of a new mixed generation, and a final, brutal massacre in Georgia, from which Eleanor alone escaped, only to die, leaving her last, final stone as a record. This fantastical story captivated a nation in the grip of the Great Depression. It was a romantic, American tragedy. But to academics, it was a screaming red flag. When we as researchers analyze the Dare stones, the case for forgery is overwhelming. The language used is a pastiche of Elizabethan English, full of anachronisms, misspellings, and grammatical structures that no 16th century Englishwoman, let alone a governor's educated daughter, would have used. The crude carvings, the uniform style across all 40 stones, and the convenient serial-like nature of their discovery all pointed to a single modern author. The source was also the key. Bill Eberhardt, the finder of the vast majority of the stones, had a deeply dubious reputation. Geological analysis showed the chisel marks were fresh and had not been weathered for 350 years. In 1941, the Saturday Evening Post published a definitive, devastating exposé that dismantled the entire saga. The academic consensus was, and remains, that the Dare stones are a hoax. They are a monument not to the lost colony, but to human gullibility, and to our profound desire for a story that fits our expectations. Why do we spend time on this forgery? Because the Dare stones are a critical part of the Roanoke story. They are a case study in how myth is made. For years, they sent researchers, both amateur and professional, on a wild goose chase, diverting critical time and resources away from the actual evidence. They cemented in the public mind a narrative of tragedy and death, making the quieter, more probable solution of assimilation seem, by comparison, dull. When we strip away these layers of speculation, massacre, and modern forgery, we are left where we began. We are left with the palisade, the dismantled houses, and the single calm word carved into the post: Croatoan. The evidence does not point to a dark and bloody end. It does not point to a sensationalized tragedy. It points to a human choice. It points south, to Hatteras Island. And it points to a new beginning, a story of survival that is, in its own way, far more profound than the myth of their vanishing. History is composed of events we can measure. We can chart the course of battles. We can read the text of treaties. We can date the foundations of cities. But history is also composed of absences. And these absences, these silences in the official record, often hold a more enduring power over our collective imagination. Jamestown, founded in 1607, is a story of brutal, desperate survival against all odds. Plymouth in 1620 is a story of ideological perseverance, but Roanoke in 1587 is a story of a void. It is a foundational question mark, a 117-person ellipsis left on the shore of a new world. And it is this very incompleteness that has made it the cultural touchstone it is. It is not the first successful colony. It is, far more compellingly, the lost colony. The narrative power of that title is immense. For centuries, it has provided a canvas upon which a new nation could project its anxieties, its romanticism, and its identity. The myth of Roanoke became a uniquely American tragedy. It was a story, particularly in the 19th century, that served a specific purpose. It was a tale of brave Anglo-Saxon pioneers, including women and the innocent child, who was swallowed by a dark, savage wilderness. It was a narrative of martyrdom, one that helped to justify the subsequent, often brutal, expansion of a colonial frontier. The lost colony in this telling had to be avenged. The wilderness had to be tamed. At the very center of this myth stands the figure of Virginia Dare. She is perhaps the most potent symbol in the entire story. She is not, in the cultural imagination, a person. She is an idea. As the first English child born in the New World, she represents a pure, innocent, Anglo-Saxon origin, a beginning that was tragically cut short. The Dare Stones, that elaborate 1930s forgery, understood this perfectly. They focused on her, making her the tragic narrator of a racial and cultural tragedy. But when we, as researchers, set aside the myth and return to the evidence, a very different Virginia Dare emerges. If we follow the Croatoan solution to its logical conclusion, Virginia Dare was not lost. She was not a tragic symbol. She was, quite simply, a survivor. She would have been a toddler when her family, her mother Eleanor and father Ananias, made the journey south to Hatteras Island. She would have grown up not in an English city of Raleigh, but within the palisades of Manteo's village. The language she would have spoken, the food she would have eaten, the beliefs she would have held, these would not have been English. They would have been Algonquian. She would have been, in all likelihood, fully integrated, perhaps marrying a Croatoan man and having children of her own. The first English child would have, in the span of a single generation, become the mother of the first admixed indigenous English children. This is the human reality that the myth obscures. The great mystery of Roanoke is, in many ways, a mystery of our own making, born from a reluctance to accept this simple human story of assimilation. We have looked for a dramatic, conclusive event, a massacre, a storm, a sinking, when the evidence points instead to a slow, quiet process. The colony was not lost. It was, from the perspective of the English crown, dissolved. The colonists were not lost. They were, from the perspective of their own cultural identity, transformed. What then is the true legacy of Roanoke? If we accept the evidence, its legacy is far more profound than the myth. It is not a story about the failure of an English colony. It is a story about the birth of an American people. The 117 colonists, in their choice to join with the Croatoan, were not an ending. They were a beginning. They were the first to do what millions would do after them, to participate in the complex, often painful, and transformative blending of cultures, languages, and bloodlines that defines the American experience. The Jamestown and Plymouth narratives are built on a foundation of separation. The English fort, the Puritan town, existing in opposition to the wilderness and its inhabitants. The Roanoke narrative, as the evidence suggests it, is one of integration. It is a story where the line between colonist and native blurred, and then vanished altogether. This is a more complicated and perhaps a more challenging foundational story. It resists easy categorization. It denies us the simple, tragic ending. It asks us to see the colonists not as victims, but as pragmatic agents of their own survival. They chose to live, and the price of that life was the very English identity they had crossed an ocean to plant. When we analyse the colonists' final, silent act, dismantling their English homes to build a new life with their indigenous allies, we are witnessing a profound moment of cultural transition. The 117 souls were not swallowed by the wilderness. They were absorbed into the human landscape that was already there. Their genetic and cultural echoes, as the Lumbee oral tradition so powerfully suggests, did not vanish. They were simply carried forward, woven into the fabric of a new, commingled people, speaking English and living in a way that was neither fully indigenous nor fully European, but something entirely new. The search for Roanoke, then, concludes not with the discovery of a final answer, but with a shift in perspective. The colonists are not lost in the woods, waiting for us to find their bones. They are, in all probability, found. They are in the handful of English pottery sherds mixed with indigenous shells at Cape Creek. They are in the resilient oral history of the Lumbee people. They are in the 16th century surnames that persist against all odds in the families of Robeson County. The mystery of Roanoke endures not because the evidence is absent, but because, perhaps, we have been looking for the wrong thing. We have been looking for a ghost story, a tragedy of vanishing. The historical reality, as supported by our most careful and methodical analysis, is a story of human adaptation, of survival, and of a quiet, unrecorded fading into history. The story of Roanoke is not a story of an end. It is the story of a beginning. We have come to the end of our journey. The story of Roanoke, like so many hidden histories, is one that asks us to look past the myth and to find the quiet, human truth. The answers are seldom dramatic, but they are always, in their own way, profound. The past is never truly lost. It is simply waiting, calmly, to be understood.